2 hours ago, the Financial Times and NBC News simultaneously dropped a story that sent shockwaves from Ottawa to Brussels, to every diplomatic capital on the planet, revealing that senior officials inside the Trump administration had held not one, not two, but three separate secret meetings at the State Department's own headquarters in Washington with the Alberta Prosperity Project, a separatist organization whose explicit and publicly stated goal is to tear Canada's wealthiest and most resource-rich province away from the Canadian Federation entirely. Meetings that took place on April 22nd, September 29th, and December 16th. Meetings whose attendees agreed as a condition of participation that they would not publicly name the American officials present. Meetings in which the group's legal counsel, Jeffrey Rath, told the Financial Times that the U.S. is extremely enthusiastic about a free and independent Alberta. Meetings in which Rath further claimed that participants were meeting very, very senior people leaving our meetings to go directly to the Oval Office. Meetings in which co-founder Dennis Modry told NBC News that at each of the three encounters, the American side informed them that the entire U.S. administration is supportive of Alberta becoming a sovereign country. Meetings in which the agenda included border security, the Canadian pension plan, national debt, currency conversion to the U.S. dollar, the development of an independent Alberta military, and a West Coast pipeline through Montana, Idaho, and Washington connecting an independent Alberta directly to Pacific shipping terminals. And the story did not stop there, because the Financial Times also reported that the Alberta Prosperity Project was planning a fourth meeting with American officials specifically to request a $500 billion line of credit from the United States government to fund Alberta's entire transition to independence if a referendum succeeded. A figure so large it represents roughly the equivalent of Alberta's entire annual GDP. And this was not a conspiracy theory. This was not speculation from anonymous sources. This was confirmed on the record by multiple named participants who attended the meetings themselves and who described in granular detail the classified environment in which at least one of those sessions took place, and it was corroborated by the second most powerful financial official in the United States government, because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had already told conservative streaming channel Real America's Voice in a public interview just days earlier that Alberta is a natural partner for the U.S., that the Albertans are very independent people, that there's a rumor they may have a referendum on whether they want to stay in Canada or not, adding, "People are saying, people are talking," while the host asked him if he knew something the public did not, which means the Trump administration was simultaneously conducting secret meetings with a Canadian separatist group inside the State Department and publicly telegraphing support for that group's goals on camera through its own Treasury Secretary. And here's where it gets serious, because what the White House was engineering was not trade negotiation, not tariff leverage, not border pressure. It was the deliberate and sustained cultivation of a separatist movement inside a NATO ally's sovereign territory, with the explicit goal of fracturing that country's political unity at the precise moment that country was presenting the most coordinated and effective resistance to American economic coercion in its entire modern history, because Mark Carney had spent the previous 14 months building an unprecedented national consensus. All 10 provinces, all major political parties, business leaders, labor unions, a country unified behind a single message that Canada would not submit to American ultimatums under any circumstances. And the Trump administration's calculated response to that unity was to secretly meet with the one internal fracture point capable of unraveling it entirely, because Alberta's grievances were real and long-standing. Alberta's oil wealth made it the financial engine of the Canadian Federation. Alberta's conservative political identity had clashed with Ottawa for decades over pipeline approvals, federal environmental regulations, and equalization payments that Albertans believed sent their tax dollars east while their energy projects were blocked. Grievances that the Alberta Prosperity Project was now weaponizing with active American encouragement and the explicit promise of $500 billion in transitional financing. And the Trump administration's own national security strategy document provided the ideological framework for exactly this kind of intervention, writing that the United States would reward and encourage the region's governments, political parties, and movements broadly aligned with our principles and strategy. Language that Rath and Modry cited directly as explaining why Washington was interested in their meetings. language that constitutional scholars and national security experts immediately recognized as a direct application of what the document calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting American dominance over the entire Western Hemisphere, including the internal democratic processes of its closest ally, and British Columbia Premier David Eby named it, with a single word that immediately circulated across every Canadian news outlet, simultaneously: treason. To go to a foreign country and to ask for assistance in breaking up Canada. There's an old-fashioned word for that, and that word is treason, he told reporters. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford backed him without hesitation, and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew delivered what became the most widely shared line of the day when he joked that if everyone was holding referendums, he wanted one too, where the only choices were yeah and heck yeah for staying in Canada. And Alberta Federation of Labor President Gil McGowan stated flatly that it doesn't feel organic. We are being targeted by the MAGA crowd, calling the entire operation foreign interference in unambiguous terms. And even Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, whose government had quietly made it easier for independence petitions to qualify for a legislative ballot, who had publicly refused to condemn the separatist movement, who had told Dennis Maudry in a 2022 public event that his organization represented the or else behind her own autonomy demands, and who separatist leaders were claiming, had privately indicated she would prefer the title of Prime Minister of an independent Alberta rather than provincial premier. Even she told reporters that the U.S. administration should respect Canadian sovereignty and confine their discussion about Alberta's democratic process to Albertans and to Canadians, which meant the premier of the very province the Trump administration was attempting to peel away from the Canadian Federation was publicly telling Washington to stay out of it, creating a political position so contradictory and exposed that political analysts across the country immediately began asking how long her balancing act could survive now that the American interference had been confirmed in writing by named participants in 3 meetings that took place at the State Department's own address. And then Mark Carney walked to the podium and delivered 7 words that were simultaneously the most restrained and the most devastating response available to any head of government confronting this precise situation. I expect the U.S. to respect Canadian sovereignty. 7 words that accomplish 3 distinct things in a single sentence. First, they place the full weight of international law behind Canada's position, because legal scholars noted immediately that sustained American engagement with a separatist movement inside a sovereign ally's territory violated the fundamental principle of non-intervention in domestic affairs that underpins every treaty framework, every multilateral institution, and every alliance structure Washington had spent 70 years constructing. Second, they forced every American ally watching to choose publicly between endorsing what the Trump administration had done or standing with the international legal order, and the EU issued a statement calling the reported meetings deeply concerning. The UK Foreign Office summoned the American ambassador for a formal explanation. Japan and Australia released coordinated statements expressing alarm at what one senior Japanese diplomat described as a precedent that threatens the sovereignty of every American partner nation. And third, those 7 words placed Danielle Smith in an impossible political position because she could not simultaneously tell Washington to respect Canadian sovereignty and continue refusing to condemn the organization that was asking Washington to do the precise opposite, and the political pressure that dynamic created inside Alberta, where Ipsos polling confirmed that the majority of Albertans were happy being part of Canada, and where even conservative voters were telling pollsters they found the American interference deeply offensive, began visibly shifting the provincial calculus in real time, and the White House response was incoherent in a way that revealed how completely the plan had misfired. A State Department spokesperson admitting the meetings took place while claiming no commitments were made. A White House official insisting no such support or any other commitments was conveyed. A statement that satisfied nobody because Bessent had already said on camera that Alberta was a natural partner. And Rath had already told the Financial Times on the record that the American side expressed full enthusiasm for Alberta sovereignty, and Maudry had already told NBC News that every meeting ended with the same message of total American support, meaning the administration was asking the world to disbelieve 3 named sources, a publicly recorded cabinet secretary interview, and two of the world's most credible news organizations simultaneously. And 2 hours ago, Washington believed it had identified the internal fracture point that would finally break Canada's united front, force province against province, and deliver the submission that tariffs, border restrictions, asset freezes, and ultimatums had all failed to produce. And 2 hours later, it had instead unified every Canadian province, including Alberta, against American interference, triggered formal diplomatic protests from its closest European and Pacific allies, handed Carney the single most powerful argument available to any leader defending national sovereignty, and proved to every nation watching that the Trump administration was not engaged in trade negotiation, but in the active and documented destabilization of a sovereign NATO ally, which is not a trade war anymore, and every government on Earth that depends on an American security guarantee just noticed.